an automation too far, a debate on AI-created art. So the two people involved in this, Ross Goodwin and William Myers, have been involved in the development of Humans Need Not Apply, our exhibition which opened last night. And hopefully some of you have got a chance to see some of the work in that show, which is really a bit of a driver around this discussion tonight, because some of the work in that show is created by humans, some of it is created by AI, and some of it is created by a combination of humans and AI. And so the guys this evening are going to be given 10 minutes each to present arguments to you about whether AI-created art is art. So before we jump into that, Ross put together a film a number of years ago.
Actually, last year.
Last year? With other people. And some AI. We'll let you do that later at the end of the year. Okay. Just last year, Ross put together film Sunspring. So we're going to show that it's the world's first sci-fi short entirely scripted by an artificial intelligence bot using neural networks. So we're going to kick off with that, which is about 10 minutes to whet your appetite, and then kick into the debate. Go ahead with that.
In a future with mass unemployment, young people are forced to sell blood. It's something I can do.
You should see the boy and shut up. I was the one who was going to be 100 years old.
I saw him again. The way you were sent to me, that was a big, honest idea. I am not a bright light.
Well, I have to go to the skull. I don't know.
What do you mean?
Well, I don't know anything about any of this, so...
Then what?
There's no answer.
We're going to see the money.
All right, you can't tell me that.
Yeah, I was coming to that thing, you know, because you're so pretty.
I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about.
That's right.
So, what are you doing?
I don't want to be honest with you.
You don't have to be a doctor.
I'm not sure. I don't know what you're talking about.
I want to see you too.
What do you mean?
I'm sure you wouldn't even touch me.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Principle is completely constructed of the same time.
It's all about you to be true.
You didn't even watch the movie with the rest of the base.
I don't know.
I don't care.
I know. It's a consequence. Whatever you need to know about the presence of the story. I'm a little bit of a boy on the floor.
I don't know. I need you to explain to me what you say.
What do you mean?
Because I don't know what you're talking about.
That was all the time.
Would have been a good time. I think I could have been my life. It may never be forgiven. But that is just too bad. I need to leave. But I'm not free of the world.
Yes, perhaps I should take it from here. I'm not going to do something.
It's not a dream. But I've got a time to stay there.
Well, I still think you could be back on the table.
It's a damn thing scared to say. Nothing is going to be a thing. But I'm the one who got on this rock with a child. And then I left the other two.
I was a boy, I was a stranger, and I promised to be so happy. I was a beautiful day, I was taller, talking.
I just wanted to tell you that I was much better than he did.
Ready to go.
I had to stop him. I couldn't even tell.
Truth was so long ago. I was so happy and blue, I was thinking of you. I was a long, long time, I was so close to you. I was a long time ago, I was ready to go. I was at home on the run.
Well, there's the situation with me and the light on the ship. The guy was trying to stop me. He was like a baby, and he was gone. I was worried about him. And even if he would have done it all, he couldn't come anymore. I didn't mean to be a virgin. I mean, he was weak. I thought I'd change my mind. He was crazy to take it out. It was a long time ago. He was a little late. I was going to be a moment. I just wanted to tell you that I was much better than he did. I had to stop him. I couldn't even tell. I didn't want to hurt him. I'm sorry, I don't like him. I can go home and be so bad. And I'll love him. And I can get him all the way out here and find a square and go to the game with him. And she doesn't show up. And then I'll check it out. But I'm gonna see him when he gets to me. He looks at me. And he throws me out of his eyes. And then he says he'll go to bed with me.
The question for us is, can a computer write a screenplay that will win a competition? And here, hopefully, is the person who owns that computer. Yes, we have received some prompts, as I think you know.
Ah, this is excellent. Okay. You want me to read it to you?
Yeah.
There's two characters named H, and we're not really sure which one is speaking. Or is Humphrey speaking to himself? I'm not really sure. That's all to be true. You didn't even see the movie with the rest of the base. I don't know. I don't care. I know that it's a consequence. Whatever you want to know about the presence of the story, I'm a little bit of a boy on the floor.
Sees a black hole in the floor, so then he looks down from the counter with a shotgun in his mouth, distracted. What's that? Shot of floor, VFX, drops the black hole on the floor.
Oh, almost out of paper.
I think the guys have decided that William is going first. Yeah. So William, if you want to prepare yourself, and Ross, do you want to sit up here so you can look at the back of his head and see if he's looking comfortable while you're. So you grab a seat there. So I didn't really properly introduce the guy. So William, before you start, is a curator and writer, and has been the driving curator behind Humans Need Not Apply. So we've been working with William for a long time. And Ross Goodwin, as you saw there, is an artist, hacker, creative technologist, who also has a piece in the show just at the back of Gallery 4, Word Camera, which is great if you get a chance to see it after the show. It writes a poem about you when you take a selfie with it. And Ross is going to take it is art side, and William is going to be on the it is not art side. So each of them will have 10 minutes. We'll go from one to the other, and then after that we'll come back out to you guys for questions, comments, and general debate. So William, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. In this brief talk, I'll support the position that machine learning output cannot be art. It's first, it's a privilege to be here with all of you on Friday night and to share a stage with Ross and to debate what's really an endlessly fascinating topic. But first, implied in this title, beware of false equivalences and of conflating correlation and causation. It's helpful first to look at something that is art. This is a work by the young German artist Uli Westphal. It's from his ongoing cultivar series in which he scours the produce markets in Berlin and hunts down peculiar-looking fruits, vegetables, and tubers. He then photographs each of these with the drama and focus of photographing sculpture, and he constructs these arrangements in different sort of color spectrums and shapes. On the one hand, it's a demonstration of technical prowess, but on the other, it's a critique of our modern expectations of food and biology generally, that these things are needing to fit into archetypes or machine-like replicability and sameness. It's also a celebration of polymorphism and mutation, the driving forces of evolution. This is counter to our expectations of things like tomatoes, which we expect to be perfectly round and perfectly red, and usually they're tasteless. So like in this example, he found all these different tomatoes and arranged and photographed those. But these beautiful little sculptures are not art. Even if you call this a portrait of evolution, it doesn't mean evolution is art. It's instead in the deliberate acts surrounding this work's production and its results that make it a work of art. This leads to the first issue when considering whether machines can make art. The word and concept are socially constructed. Every work of art made by every person subtly changes the meaning of art, or the idea of it, for everyone, since, like money is a shared illusion. It's a bit like the phenomenon of gravity, in which every atom in the universe communicates its mass and its position to every other atom in the universe at the speed of light. This makes for dizzying complexity in trying to nail down art's definition. It is certainly a fluid thing. So you might say, well, if it's flexible, why don't we just then say that machines can make art too? The answer is that once you grant this, you shift art's meaning to include things that are made by entities not on the construction side of meaning. Or to go back to the example of gravity, it's like claiming that atoms with no mass possess it. While we're nerding out a little bit on physics, let's look at the Carina Nebula. It's a vastly complex and aesthetically splendid arrangement of mass and energy. If we grant that machines can make art, then we have to extend this too to natural phenomena, to other non-actors in the social sphere. This would include whale songs, the mating dances of birds, and every sunset, everywhere, every day. The second issue involves experience. There's a lot to say about this, but a straightforward example is offered by abstract expressionism. Without lived experience, it's robbed of its potential and perhaps intentional meanings. A work like this makes sense to us when you think about how it's made, and that's part of the point Jackson Pollock was making. His compositions required him to move in space and make wide gestures with his arms, requiring him to feel his bones, tendons, and muscles. And yet we don't know all of Pollock's intentions, nor could we ever, even if he was still alive. This is another ingredient in art that makes it unique to people, the unknowability of what another person thinks and feels. The mystery of this, behind and within everything another person creates, is a foundational block of creative excellence. Machines, on the other hand, follow by definition a series of commands and behaviors that are necessarily knowable and endlessly replicable. They have a code, or maybe layers of code, but they're still instructions and finite. Even if you build in complexity, variation, and some kind of inscrutable barriers to our limited cognition, you're still stuck with the problem that it's not truly random, and it never reaches an infinite state. Once we can design perhaps a machine that designs another more complex machine that works in ways that we completely cannot understand, then perhaps that can make something approaching art. The true complexity of which is captured well in this quote. That's by Alfred Barr, the first founding director of MoMA. It sums up just some of, but the major factors that make the possibilities of art infinite. Please forgive the old white man quote delivered to you by a white man with embedded in the text a reference to art as being made by men. But more seriously, to continue on the idea that art is the focus of human experience, it's worth pointing out some more ways that humans differ from robots and machine learning. A useful working checklist for good art is that it blends creativity, risk, and the pursuit of excellence. Why risk? Well, any work of art or any work that one does is an investment. It's a decision to do one thing instead of another. It's a trade-off. Since you're a mortal being and a machine is not, the acts that you can make like this are limited, and they demand intentionality. You can make a work of art, and when you do so, you give to the world a bit of yourself that you'll never, ever quite get back. There's an unmistakable poetry to this, that in every brushstroke and musical note that you make, a bit of your life is embedded. Machines can make no such claim, as they work relentlessly, relatively endlessly, and without consequences to themselves. In fact, they possess no self at all. Programs are, in their coded and replicable nature, necessarily contextless. They do not have a claim to any definite time or place in the same way that we all do as people. Nor are they able to think about their own thinking. This is a phenomenon called metacognition, and is critical to the process of making anything and training on any skill or evaluating progress. You must be able to think about what you used to be thinking, what you are thinking now, and what you might think in the future to develop in any meaningful way as an artist. One of the most thoughtful critics and scholars of urban design and architecture, Chris Alexander, pointed out another problem that is related here. The codification of the world or the environment is problematic, limiting, and sometimes distracting. Data are not impartial, despite what everyone thinks about them. Data are gathered, maintained, and shared following agendas, value systems, and biases. Data sets essential to train any AI exist in a context that includes the presence or the absence of other data. So for a moment, if you can imagine if you were training an army of robocops with crime statistics gathered in the United States, that information would not include the number of deaths that occur in interactions with police, because these are data sets that, intentionally or not, are not widely reported and collected. So your army of robocops might not understand why some people of color in communities would feel nervous around the police. To final points, back to art. Talk with a neurobiologist at some point and ask them how well we understand now the phenomenon of intelligence and thinking. They're probably going to laugh. Our understanding of these things is only scratching the surface. Until we can reliably describe and understand how intelligence works, it's probably a mistake to call these machines or programs intelligent. The phenomenon called GAI, or General Artificial Intelligence, is a long way off still, according to experts. This is the version of AI that would truly mimic human brains in terms of their adaptability and complexity. But I would say, even if that day comes tomorrow, the GAI still cannot make art. To say why that is, Let's have a look at a painting that you can see upstairs. This is Meeting on Gauguin's Beach from 1989. It points to the potential of co-creativity with AI and was made by the painter/programmer Harold Cohen. He coded in a programming language called C this algorithm, or a set of algorithms called Aaron, and this bot could somewhat endlessly draw the contours of compositions like this, and then Mr. Cohen added color by way of oil paint. He started this kind of work back in the 70s, but all through the time of his writing and presentations, he was always careful to say that his machines were not being creative, that instead creativity springs from the ability to reflect on human experience. This supports the point that only humans can make art or produce works of meaning and beauty. To underline the point, I offer you a little rhyme. A machine does not cry, tell a lie, sigh, fear to die, or crave a slice of pie. A program does not at some point awkwardly for advantage vie, or feel excitement at the sight of a bare, muscular thigh, or at the sound of news feel knots in its stomach tie. A machine cannot be crushed by the sound of someone saying bye, or think it could smell colors while it's high. Finally, a word about the value of experience from the Irish playwright John Patrick Shanley. He said the following upon accepting the Academy Award for the Best Screenplay in 1988 for the film Moonstruck. I dedicate this award to everybody who ever punched me or kissed me, and everybody who I ever punched or kissed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
On the nose, time-wise.
This is going to be tough. All right, do I hit the button to start mine?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. In this speech, I'm going to prove to you, in at least 3 ways, that machines can make art. I'm going to talk about a concept I want to call art versus art prime, and I'll get to that. I'm going to read you an email that I wrote to a 9-year-old who told me I was making fake art. And I'm going to talk about a game called Advanced Chess. But first, I want to tell you a story. Sometime last spring, my fiance's cousin asked me to read some generated poetry at a traditional poetry reading at the Leonard Library in Brooklyn. And I was actually very nervous about reading neural network generated material in front of quote unquote real poets. My Twitter profile says not a poet, and I sort of take that to heart. But I did it, and it went very well. One of the poets actually told me afterwards that something I read had actually messed him up, quote unquote. The poems I read were generated from photographs on the theme of romance, because it was Valentine's Day. And it was this one, generated from a photograph of this VJ Day kiss, a very famous photograph by Alfred Eisenstadt, that seemed to contain a flashback from the male perspective. So I'll read this poem to you now, and you can decide for yourself whether that's the case. A black and white photo of a woman walking down a street, sitting in the kitchen that was filled with the morning wind in the barn, where he sat up and saw her in the darkness for a while. And he had been a man and had not even reached the altar, and lived there alone, and without the beginning of the first white shirt and the balanced chair before him, the cool sky seemed to be still in the branches of the barn. And he stood there for a moment. And so the boy stretched out and smelled the skirt and saw it, and he said to himself, he was a little boy, and he had some things we had wanted to do. And he said that he was going to think of the better that he was to speak of, because he was particularly intelligent too. But now he put his hand on the foot of the barn, and he sat around the stove, and he sat there, his hands as a boy who had been drunk and standing in the doorway from the gate and up the stairs. And then for 3 years ago, and sometimes he was a mile away with a fire, and his back was not as tall as the light of a straw hat. So I had been worried because I had once heard my mentor, Alison Parrish, say that so much commentary about computational creative writing focuses on computers replacing humans. But as anyone who has worked with computers and language knows, that perspective, which Alison summarized as, now they're even taking the poet's job, is highly uninformed. Because when we teach computers to write, the computers don't replace us any more than pianos replace pianists. They become our pens, and we become more than writers. We become writers of writers. But the idea that my work is an art isn't ridiculous. It's the question that a 9-year-old asked me in the email. She told me I was making fake art, and I will now read you my response to her. Hi, Elliot. Don't worry about it. Your email was not rude. In fact, I really appreciate that you're telling me the full truth about what you think. Moreover, I'm impressed that you're thinking these very complex thoughts about art and semantics. I know I wasn't thinking about that stuff yet when I was your age. You're also an excellent writer. Not sure if your dad told you, but I used to be a political ghostwriter, which means I would write things for politicians to say. It was a pretty weird job. To respond to what you said about credit, I actually agree with you. And for those reasons, I try not to take credit for the machine's output. I only take credit for the software and the concept. However, you might be interested to know that I've spoken to lawyers, and copyright law in the United States dictates that I could legally take full credit for the output if I wanted to do so. I also think you've got some very interesting thoughts about art. As I'm sure you know, folks have been debating about what art is and what it isn't for a very long time. Since the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of this debate has centered around the work of Marcel Duchamp, who invented a type of art piece he called a ready-made. Even though it's been almost 100 years since Duchamp signed a toilet and put it in a gallery for sale, his work remains controversial. A more recent example of an artist who pushes the edge of what's considered art is Richard Prince, who made a piece called Untitled Cowboy by photographing a Marlboro cigarette advertisement and cropping it. His rephotographed photograph sold for over $1 million at auction. I like Duchamp, but I actually do not like Richard Prince at all. Just thought you might find his work to be an interesting reference, given the questions you're asking. In my work, I believe the artwork is not actually the output, the receipts with poems on them, which is why I hand out the receipts rather than keeping them for myself. The artwork is the concept itself, a camera that automatically produces expressive text based on the images it captures. I think creating these machines is about augmenting human creativity, not about replacing it. Why not give people the ability to write with cameras instead of pens? You ask, if your phone writes a poem, can you really take advantage of it? Well, if the poetry is good, if it makes us think, I think we can certainly read it and become inspired by its words. I definitely recognize that my device is not human level yet, but I think you could already understand the implications, that it could someday, maybe even soon, start emitting human level poetry and prose. And so I think we need to consider what we should be doing with machine intelligences like that, because nobody wants to see machines replace human authors. That's why I'm not trying to create or promote fully automated writing machines. What I'm trying to create is more like a word piano, a sort of instrument that you play, but rather than music, you're producing text, augmenting your creativity with a machine. And the first interface I'm considering for this type of machine is a camera, traditionally used only for making images. Thanks again for your thoughts, Elliot. Your words are truly invaluable to me, and I genuinely hope you'll keep asking yourself and writing about questions like the ones you posed in your email. Please let me know if you have any other questions about my work or anything else. Best, Ross. So I want to end with this final argument, and this is stolen from Douglas Eck, who's the head of the Magenta team at Google, which does computer-generated music right now. And this argument is called creativity and creativity prime. So let's think about these concepts, creativity and creativity prime. I'm going to call creativity, and for the sake of this argument, let's call it art and art prime. Art, let's say, is what's made by humans. Art prime is the group of things made by humans and machines. But if something inspires us, who really cares what we call it? Because if generated music makes us run faster on a treadmill, who cares if it's music? Yes, names are important, but we shouldn't let the limits of our naming conventions, the limits of our language, disrupt our cultural progress. At a certain point, practice becomes more important than theory, because it's what we do that matters. For example, the best translation software today, Google Translate or anything equivalent, doesn't concern itself with linguistic theory at all. It simply uses neural networks to transfer style between strings of characters. So you take a string of English, and you literally have the computer using a process that we do not understand, translated into a thing of, or a sentence in French or in Irish or in any other language. And to me, that's really telling, because again, it's about what we're doing, not about what we're calling it, not about the theory, it's about the practice. Advanced chess, also known as centaur chess, is a powerful metaphor here too. It's a chess variant where both players have access to a powerful chess computer. And games played exhibit extremely complex tactics, unseen in games between humans or between computers alone. So what can this tell us about how we should be making art? I think the answer is pretty obvious. So what have I talked about? I've told you about my personal experiences presenting generated poetry in an artistic context. I've told you about how my debating opponent likely told you asked the same questions a 9-year-old asked me. And I've told you about art and art prime, and I've told you about advanced chess. And I hope you by now reach the conclusion that none of this actually matters. Art is not something we get to define as individuals. It's something much bigger than that. Because ultimately, we don't create art. Art creates us. Thank you.
Okay. 2 strong arguments. Before we go out to the audience, do either of you want to seek any kind of clarification from each other? Questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll go. And I'll try to make this at least a 10-year-old question.
9.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. So okay, as someone who is a wordsmith and who really appreciates language, I was surprised that you made this argument that what we call it doesn't matter. Because ultimately, meaning, words are the vehicle of meaning and understanding. And yes, they're malleable, but I think by calling this art, you undervalue certain human labors and it mischaracterizes creativity. Perhaps what's needed, I'd propose, is a new word that we can invent. Maybe instead of art, it's called MART, machine art. Or,
yeah, I don't know. I agree. I think what we need is new language, actually. I totally agree with that. But I also think that, the idea that words are the sole conveyor of meaning is not correct necessarily. As Wittgenstein said, the world is everything that is the case, which means that the world is what is real and not how we describe it. The world is not the map of itself, right? The world is the world. So we cannot say that language is the sole conveyor of meaning. The sole conveyor of meaning is probably something more abstract than that. Language is something that humans created to communicate with each other and to describe the world around them, but it's limited as something that's created by our own minds and exists within our own minds. And I just think that at a certain point, the deep learning revolution, and it is a revolution, is occurring in computer science because we've stopped worrying so much about whether what we're doing aligns with all of the hundreds of years of academic theory that tends to distract us from actually solving problems. And I don't say that as an academic, I say that as an artist, because I think that art is problem solving in a certain way. When you're making a piece of art, you are trying to convey a feeling, a notion, a thought, an idea to an audience. And to me, that is a problem that you're trying to solve. What's the best way to convey that thing? And maybe the best way is with a word, maybe the best way is with a painting, maybe the best way is with a camera, but the way is going to differ depending on what exactly you're trying to convey. So I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this at this point, but maybe you get the idea.
Well, I can't argue against the...
William, can you put your mic closer to your mic?
Oh, sure.
Sorry to interrupt your train of thought.
Yes, so I'm certainly not going to argue against the variability of human expression. I think I would defend that as well. But I do think words have this special, they have this special ability to guide and direct thought and to connect different concepts. So I would advocate for calling this new kind of creativity something else.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to the audience. Ross, did you have something you wanted to?
I don't have to. You can absolutely take it to the audience.
Just in case somebody's head is exploding and they want to really say something. Any questions, thoughts, provocations from the audience? No? Broad agreement?
I've got a quick question. So it seems that both your kind of points are convincing, but at the moment, a lot of AI-created art, if you kind of squint at it, it looks or sounds like art that might be indistinguishable from human-created art. But let's assume that AIs can soon create stuff which is totally indistinguishable. Scripts, poetry, paintings, and nobody can really tell if it's human created or machine created. Who's to say it's not art then?
I'll say it's not art.
I definitely won't.
A quick show of hands. Anybody else would say it's not art of the entire audience? Who says it's not art? Hands up high so we can see. It may change during the course of the discussion. And those of you who would say it is art. Hands up high. So
It's actually fairly half and half. I think that it's not art, has it slightly, but not by much. Go!
Well, I would say that the circumstances around a work's creation greatly affect whether or not you can call it art. And certainly, we've seen this with with the invention of photography. Painting evolved and changed, and it took on different meanings. It moved towards abstraction. It went into new directions, and that wasn't a bad thing. And so it probably will be the case with AI-assisted creative works, or AI-generated works, if you want to call them that. We'll move on to, or art will refocus onto things that can't be automated.
I just want to add one more thing, which is, a lot of, I think, the argument that it's not art, or that it will never be art. We can't call what machines are making art, even if they're not operated by humans. Let's say a machine, because obviously I think there's co-creativity, like you mentioned, and there's circumstances where a human's operating a machine in order to make art, and that clearly is art. Photography is art. We've sort of established that. Mm-hmm. We've established that, painting is art, even if you use a brush and not just your hands. So, I think it's okay to use a machine in your art, obviously. Why I think it will be art even if the machine does all the work is not only because a human has maybe designed this machine. Let's say the machine designed itself. Why that's still art is because technology is not an other. Technology is human. We are cyborgs. We always have been. From the earliest ages of humanity, we use cooking fires. We have short guts because we use cooking fires to cook our meat. We wear glasses, we take medicine. We always have been doing things to our bodies and to ourselves and to our minds with technology. And to think of it as an other is wrong, I think. And it's part of us. It's something we created. And as soon as that thing starts to create itself, to think of it, again, to continue to think of it as an other will actually, I think, become dangerous.
Well, then you would agree with me that if you enter that realm, you're shifting the meaning of art so that it has to include things like the sun and the spiral of a galaxy.
Well, that's if you believe that the universe was created by something, I guess, like something intelligent. That's we're not having a debate right now.
Certainly the parameters
we're
of
in a
our
science
debate
gallery.
have changed.
I think we're a science gallery, so we all know what we think about it.
But the meaning of words shifts constantly. This is not a new thing, right? I mean, if you look at I can't think of a great example right now, but I'm sure there are plenty. It's just, but I think that in a certain way, in the past we didn't have machines that could do this. So to somehow exclude them from our prior definition, I think, is sort of ex post facto in a way. It's just you're taking something that probably should be grandfathered into the art clause in our in our semantics, and you're just excluding it because technology is not us, but it is us.
I think it's not us, because I think it lacks agency. I mean, technology is ultimately neutral. It's how we use it that gives it any meaning. So it comes back to human intention.
I disagree about that completely, actually. I do not think it's how we use it that gives it meaning. It's how we perceive it on the other end. Because meaning is not something that's created by intent. Meaning is created by perception. So when we look at a painting, we decide what it means. And when we look at a computer-generated piece of art, it's very much, especially with something like Sunspring, which you all just watched, the movie's very much like a Rorschach test. I always like seeing audiences watch it because they always laugh in different places, and that amuses me. Some audiences have watched the whole thing without laughing at all. And the fact of the matter is that, in a certain way, the audience is writing the film as they're watching it, because they're deciding what it means, and their interpretation is completely valid, whatever it is. There's so many different versions of the film. There's the version that came out of the computer that was on paper. There's the version that I saw. There's the version that Oscar Sharp, the director, saw when he sort of gave the instructions to the actors, and there's a version each actor saw, and then there's the version every viewer sees when they see the film. And each of those versions is a valid version, and each of them has a distinct meaning.
The one that's significant is the one we saw, in part because...
But which one that we saw? The one that you saw, or the one that I saw?
The one that has been seen on whatever YouTube a million or millions of times.
By which viewer, though?
It doesn't matter.
Oh, I think it does, though.
Because what I'm about to say is about the content. What we're seeing is, I mean, if it had stayed in the form of pages in your hand, we wouldn't be talking, and this wouldn't be that important a discussion. What makes this compelling is the acting,
the stage direction. Those are all done masterfully. And that's why the audience, as you I think correctly said, the audience is writing the story with you, and they're interpreting it and they're experiencing it all in individual ways, and that is quite interesting, and that is art. But I think it rests on mostly the performance of the actors and again the stage direction and cinematography.
I mean, I will grant that like the actors obviously imbue a lot of the meaning that's perceived. Like, for example, how many people thought there was a love triangle going on in the movie? Like, a lot of people did. I mean, that's like the most obvious interpretation, I think. But I also think that, I've actually really loved reading people's analyses of the movie online. One person, for example, I don't know if it was apparent or whether this was adequately communicated, but not only the dialogue was generated, the action sequences also were. So that whole scene where Thomas Middleditch is, you see two of him, and then he's in front of the stars, and he's on the phone, he's pulling the camera. That's all stage direction that's written by a computer. And I mean, to me, that is really, that really shows the potential of what can happen when we have this sort of Rorschach test that we can interpret. And it's really more beautiful than an ink blot, right? It's actually coherent prose. And coherent prose is something that is, we can say whether prose is grammatically correct, but saying whether it's meaningful is entirely dependent on the context. And in this case, I think we add context, but we also, it's the interpretation plus the machine. But again, the script is still a piece of art, though, I think.
I'm just going to jump in and go back into it. So there's a discussion that's happening that's sort of about this idea of art as intent or art as perception a little bit. I'm going to throw that out to the audience and see if there's any thoughts or feedback on that. Is it, in terms of your collective viewing of that particular film, do you think that your reaction to it was more affected by the fact that you were watching it in a room with another group of people, in perception of that work? We see that a lot in Science Gallery, the social aspect of it. So how people are actually interacting with something when it's happening, or is it as, the intent that's behind it? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting what you're bringing up in terms of kind of a quite radical subjectivity. But do you not see art as kind of a two-way street in that we don't know how anyone else sees art? We know that we see it as art, or we don't, and someone has created it as art in a separate subjective prism. And that kind of art bridges those two normally radically distinct subjectivities, and that's why you need an artist who is a human and a viewer who is a human. You're halfway there with a viewer as a human, but are you not missing part of that relationship?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said about, at the very end of my speech, about art creating us, not the other way around. Because I think that each one of us has our own kind of internal definition for art, and they're probably pretty similar, but they probably differ a bit from person to person too, right? And the question I think that's relevant to ask is, how did we each create that definition of art within our heads? Well, most likely we created it by absorbing pieces of art throughout our lives, having other people tell us that this is art, or seeing something as art due to its context, and sort of adding that into the definition that we're constantly expanding within our minds. And so, as a result, I think that you're right that it is a two-way street, but it's also very subjective and very dependent on the culture that's appreciating the art, I think, and the individual.
Is there another question somewhere around here? Oh, here.
I'm just wondering, from your script came up, Ross, do you call that bit art, or the final product would be art? Because I say, as a writer or a filmmaker, I'd like to not believe that AI can create art, but I am skeptical, because if I read things like steal like an artist, if you write, you draw on, you steal things. You don't intentionally do it, but you draw from things that you have seen throughout your life to form a story, and you fed all those stories to your machine, which just made its own one. Isn't that really what I do with my own stories? So is there a difference if the machine did it or I did it? I found that's the exact same, but that would have produced what script I seen on the screen, but I feel the actual art touch then is what the actors did to it. I felt that makes it art, so I don't think that the art can be created without the human. I think the human experience of what they have just saw and the perception of what they've just saw is the art bit itself. I don't know if you agree with do you think it's already art?
So I'll step out of my debating role for a minute and say that I actually don't know. And I think it's an open question. And I think that's interesting, what's interesting about it. I'm sort of inclined to say that it is art because there's this great Nietzsche quote. Nietzsche was the first philosopher to use a typewriter. And he thought that the fact that he used a typewriter rather than writing things by hand was actually changing the way not only that he thought about writing, but the way that he thought in general. And he was a pretty smart guy, regardless of what you think about him. So it's worth considering that perspective. And legally speaking, at least in the United States, I wrote the screenplay. I just used a really, really fancy typewriter, right? So it's really hard to say what actually wrote the screenplay. It's more like, the best analogy, the analogy I like is it's sort of like, and this is sort of the way I think about training neural nets, is that it's like being a chef. You're putting all these ingredients into a soup, and hopefully the soup tastes good when it's done. I think Sunspring was like, honestly, the point of Sunspring was not to make the best possible film with an AI. I mean, obviously the filmmakers did an incredible job. But the point was, we did not curate the output at all. We literally generated a script and filmed it. And it wasn't the best script we could have generated. We could have generated 100 scripts and picked the best one, but we didn't do that, right? So it's worth asking, there was a couple of really good lines in that film. I'm sure everyone heard, the last line, which in particular has been quoted online a lot. There's also like lines in the action description that are really powerful. Like the one that kind of produced that scene where he's sitting on the floor and standing in front of the stars is he's standing in the stars and sitting on the floor. And somebody online pointed out that's like a really powerful metaphor for the mundane aspects of space travel. And I just love those, how we can apply these really complex interpretations to some of the lines in the script. And so and I know from Word Camera, I have a version of Word Camera, I don't know if everyone's seen it out there, where I add a curation step. It's very simple. When the sentence comes out of the computer, I just say yes or no. And that curation step makes the poems good 100% of the time, rather than just 50% of the time. So it's really interesting the ways that we can sort of circumvent the shortcomings of our current technology by simple curation and simple interface design. So I don't know the exact answer to your question, but I hope that helps.
William, anything to?
Well, I'll just tack on to that something that's worth mentioning in this context when we talk about audience interpretation and this difference between perception and intent when trying to figure out what's art. I think it's imagine for a second that you're a blind painter and you live in an isolated place, you never go outside, and you're alone, and you paint pictures all day and they sit in their closet. That still can be art even if no one ever sees it, not even yourself, right? Because you're a human making this thing and you're expressing yourself. And there's a difference with, because it sounds like the way that we were talking about art is the way that I distinguish art and design. Design, on the other hand, is different because that needs an audience. That is necessarily needs to be directed towards other people, users, an audience, something like that. So I think that's just a worthy mention about art that makes it particularly special.
We probably have time for, one more before we.
Sometimes feel I should know by now. Here we go. You conjured up an idea in my eye.
You conjured up a question in my head about. I'm never going to say it there in 2 minutes. That could we say that our lives are an art form? Living our lives is an art form?
Depends on how you live your life, I think.
Say again?
So I think it depends on how you live your life. Do you dance everywhere that you go? I don't know. I'm kidding.
If you're hiding it in a closet and nobody can see it, it doesn't really matter, does it? You're still creating an art.
There are performance artists who have done massively long performance pieces. Like what's the guy's name who put himself in a prison cell for a whole year and like. He was in New York. This is in the 70s. He's sort of a contemporary of Marina Abramovic, but I'm blanking out of his name. But there's this artist in the 70s who did a bunch of these year-long pieces where one of them was he locked himself in a tiny prison cell. One of them was he had to punch a clock every hour for a whole year. And you should Google any of this, you'll find the guy's name, because there's only one person who's ever done this. And one of them was he lived outside in New York City for an entire year. And so, yes, your life can absolutely be art. The question is whether you want it to be, I think. And whether people will perceive it as art. Again, art is a subjective definition. So if you think it's art, then in a certain way it is. But if the society around you doesn't think it's art, then in a certain way it's not. So it's
socially constructed.
It's socially constructed, yeah.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to just do a quick tally again. Those of you who think that AI work is art, raise your hand. Those of you who think that it's not. And then I'm going to ask a slightly different question. I'm sorry for this, Ross, but those of you who think Sunspring is art.
Thank you.
And those of you who don't.
I love you anyway, don't worry.
We'll leave on that slight distinction what that means. Thanks for joining us this evening, guys. They'll be hanging around for a few questions if you want to pop down.